Hello, my name is Brian Kuhn.
And my name is Nina Butterfield.
Today, we're presenting on using recovery management principles and practices to improve your substance use disorder outcome call, purpose, and method. Today's date is December 29, 2022. Here's the agenda for our talk today. We'll cover measurement, principles, how we got there, tips, and consolidation of the content. By way of description, treatment as usual in the SUD arena includes the practice of discharge and data collection to examine outcomes. These concepts and practices contradict addiction illness as a chronic disease and the value of ongoing information at the level of the person served. This presentation will describe principles and practices that diverse SUD treatment and recovery support organizations can use to improve their outcome follow-up call purpose and completion rate. Relevant innovation and change management practices will be shared toward maximizing site-specific development and refinement of follow-up call methodology.
And with this presentation, we'd like to encourage the consideration of a long-term model of care that matches a lifelong disease process, but also facilitates data collection. So with this, consider follow-up calls as part of a continuing care service and approach them as such when implementing this practice.
By the end of this presentation, the attendee will be able to understand the principles of reinforcement, attribution, and person-centered purposes toward maximizing patient adherence to outcome evaluation processes. Discuss the importance of measuring the response rate and change effort impacts toward reaching the response rate goal. Apply recovery coaching as a recovery management value while completing a data collection outcome call. Recall the critical phases of the clinical process during which orientation to outcome evaluation can be discussed and incentivized. And understand outcome evaluation as an embedded piece of ongoing recovery management, recursive to continuing care. Serve the interest and purpose of the customer. If the audience member gains nothing else from any of the slides or any of the points in the talk, it would be the centrality of this, that meeting the interest and purpose of the customer is paramount. Next, we'll take a look at measurement. Here's a hypothetical data display, and we have another. The point here is in any change effort to measure the incremental impacts of your efforts as you make attempts toward reaching a goal. And without the data showing the incremental effects of your change effort, you're flying blind and aren't sure you're making improvements. So we just want to emphasize the importance for everyone of measuring the impacts as you move toward your goal. Next, we'll look at principles related to recovery management and improvement of outcome calls. First are some elementary principles from behaviorism. One is the notion that the rat is always right. The idea here is that we learn from the person we're working with, not the other way around. So if you're struggling to maximize your effectiveness in your outcome call purpose and method, learn from those you serve rather than expect them to conform to what you're doing.
And Brian, I'd just like to expound on this idea by drawing a comparison with business models, especially, for instance, in the restaurant world. There's the common saying, the customer is always right, the consumer is always right. And they're always right because their perspective and their experience drives the success of the project or the business. So therefore, it's important to look to the consumer to understand how to model the project. So we're going to talk about that in depth today. And an important approach to this is to be authentic in your intent. So adopting an authentic mindset of wanting to serve the customer. This mindset alone is going to enhance the responsiveness and the buy-in of the customer, and in this case, the client. And so, for instance, thinking of what the customer wishes to derive from the calls and what the client wishes to derive from the calls.
A second principle from behaviorism is that the rat picks the reward. A common example would be something like a food reward for a specific behavior. And what's important to understand is that nothing is intrinsically rewarding by its nature. Rather, it depends upon the instance. So, for example, the first Big Mac might be a reward, but the third one in a row might end up being a punisher. And the important principle is that the one you're working with picks what is, in that instance, rewarding, or in that instance, is not rewarding. And the idea of the contingency that you're bringing is intrinsically rewarding. And therefore, because I know that it is intrinsically rewarding, it will therefore work, is flawed reasoning from a behavioral standpoint. So in like fashion, Business Development 101 would then tell us if they're not a customer first, they're not a patient second. We'll take a look at a few detailed behavioral principles to improve and amplify the clarity of these notions. First, a reinforcer then is anything that increases the frequency of a response. And a punisher then is anything that decreases the frequency of a response. The point here is that a reinforcer or a punisher is one as defined by its effects, not by its essence. Attribution is important, and it's the intrinsic or extrinsic reason for doing a behavior. And we may fail to consider attribution and over-rely on our belief about the effects of a reinforcer. Architecture is related to the shape of a behavioral pattern over time. Over time, how does the one we're working with behave, and what are the patterns of that behavior? It's important to consider the architecture of behavior or the shape of a behavioral pattern over time so that your efforts are relatively matched to that architecture rather than relatively mismatched. An intervention then is a total strategy matched to architecture, shaping successive approximations to a goal. Contingency Management 201 then could be summarized this way. You can punish or even eliminate a naturally occurring behavior. How so? Reward the behavior. Over time, the attribution shifts to the reward, and then withdraw the reward. And what happens here is something that is happening naturally can be eliminated by changing the attribution to an external reward, and then by withdrawing the reward, the cognition or the attribution changes that now that the reward is gone, I will no longer do it, when they were naturally doing it at the start. Now that we've covered the importance of measurement and some elementary principles of behavior, we'll take a look at how we got there in terms of our outcome call follow-up rate. Our efforts are a blend really of three sources of theory and practice. Those three sources are recovery coaching, recovery management checkups, and NIATEC's change principles. Within recovery coaching, we take the long view over years. We use specific knowledge and skill that is found in recovery coach training. And this is not the same as counseling or sponsoring. And we've taken recovery coach methods and baked them into our clinical programming. So this leaves us in a natural state where the one doing the follow-up call is using methods that are already familiar to the individual being served. The recovery management checkup methodology has a significant literature attached to it, which we won't go through in depth here, but we've put some information in front of the audience. This comes from Lighthouse Institute. It's important to understand the 20-minute call limit retains the value of the call rather than let the call go long and lose value. And the methodology of recovery management checkups is seated in listening and engaging and supporting and not asking questions, but rather filling in the items as you go. And if you need to ask questions, do so at the end. In our system, our alumni department does these calls. NIATEC's change principles are a topic all on their own, and the emphasis is on high tech and high touch, meaning sophisticated tech methods that also feel warm and accurate, putting the customer first as the best source of feedback and maximizing our technical and clinical effectiveness, making rapid changes as needed toward reaching our goal, and not having fear of making changes in system improvement because we can always change back to our old method if our new changed method doesn't work.
And Brian, I'd like to connect some of these practice points to some of the fundamental core values within behavioral psychology, which you just mentioned. So for instance, a 20-minute call limit is making sure that the length of the call does not become a punisher to the client, or not asking questions, listening, engaging, and supporting the client as a service can be a reinforcer to accept a future call. So just reiterating that we really want to focus on building an environment within the call that becomes a reinforcer to the client.
Next, we'll look at some tips. In our system, we decided to match the notion of outcome call purpose and method to the timeline of experience of the person served. So we first raise the notion and discuss outcome calls with the person served during pre-intake orientation. The next major iteration and process where we review outcome call purpose and method is in the actual intake itself. And during intake, we provide a second orientation to the idea of follow-up calls. The third major increment is during the treatment process itself. And we include orientation again during this third segment of time. Prior to patient exit from the treatment structure, we cover outcome calls once again. And the last then is the post-exit follow-up call itself, the first call, which becomes the fifth touch point in a continuous process that's occurred over time.
And here I'd like to offer some examples of what these time points look like in terms of practical application. So for the first time point, this is where the organization pitches to the client. So this happens on the admissions level. So for instance, an organization could have admissions mention involvement in evidence-based research and informed program development as a unique asset of the program. So this is really something to brag about. Hey, we are participating in a national level database collection that's going to inform higher quality care for for yourself and for future clients. And this is a common practice in the healthcare world. We see this with teaching hospitals and some of the highest quality hospitals. They're promoting the idea that they are participating in ongoing research to inform evidence-based practice. This is not a common thing that's happening in behavioral health, but so it gives the organization a unique perspective and a unique pitching point. So that would be the first introduction of being involved in a research project or any type of data collection for the client. At the second time point, we could provide a universal letter of consent during the admission process. So on the day of admission, when the client shows up at the organization, as part of the typical paperwork, there would be a consent to participate in a NATAP related project, and they would have the option to sign a consent for their data to be recorded during part of the normal service, which is the follow-up service after treatment is completed. So that's a second time point or touch point. The third time point could occur during the residential treatment process. And this could be a time where a recovery coach would be introduced to the client who has agreed to participate in a research project or a data collection, so that they can really put a face to a name. And that sets the scene for the fifth follow-up, which I'll come to at the end. For the fourth time point, the exit interviewer can reintroduce the concept that the client will be receiving a series of calls, that this is part of a high quality service of continuing care that shows the organization's support of the client's success and recovery. And then as the final post-exit follow-up, the fifth time point, the recovery coach is going to reach out and make that initial call. And this is where the third time point becomes incredibly important to that fifth time point where the action is implemented, because when the client sees the call from the recovery coach, they're going to remember a face, and facial recognition is so crucial to a human's perception of the experience.
One tip we wanted to share was the notion of raising your locator rate, not just your follow-up call response rate. This notion comes from a lesson I learned at a previous workplace in our field that was involved in a multi-year federal grant. It turns out that the grant evaluation component was held by Lighthouse Institute. And Lighthouse Institute, as a requirement, was pursuing locating those formerly treated in a residential setting, and through trial and error for that subpopulation from that program, figured out that they could locate individuals previously served through calling other individuals. And in that project, those are listed here. I've highlighted grandmother and probation officer because while the others were helpful, these were the two in that subpopulation that brought the highest amount of variance of knowing where the person was and how to reach them. I'd just like to highlight that for everyone to consider in your service area with your subpopulation, who is it that can be networked with to raise your locator rate? And that might be important to address prior to attempting to raise your outcome call response rate.
And I'd like to reiterate that by staying in touch with the contacts of the client, we're not only expanding our ability to reach the client and to further serve them, but we're also reiterating that attitude of service. So for every client treated, 10 people are experiencing a positive effect and a positive change. We know that substance use disorder is a family disease. So we are also serving these family members by maintaining contact with them.
Also, by way of tips, examples of implementation, consider assignment of the duty of the outcome call to the best fit in your organization, service area, and for the population you serve. Should the call be completed by a recovery coach? And should the calls essentially take on the nature of a coaching call? If so, a culture of excellence, listening for follow-up data, and data being recursive to coaching might be a general pattern or motif by which such an effort could succeed. Alternatively, in your organization, you might decide that it would be best to have alumni or alumni services staff complete calls under the notion of an alumni call. If that were the case, again, a culture of excellence, listening for follow-up data, rather than all of the data always being explored in the form of a question, and data therefore being recursive to support from alumni.
And something I'd like to add to this is no matter who your organization is choosing to make these calls, it's important to sort of channel this energy of presenting to the client almost as a best friend. So channel your inner best friend. That's part of that is listening first, asking second, approaching with a giving, not a getting attitude, and reaching out with the intent to really just check in and, hey, how are you? We haven't talked in a long time. So whoever is making that call is going to be someone who would be able to reach the client with that tone.
Another tip would be to invent your own secret sauce. I'd like to draw your attention to the very bottom of this slide, where it states a focus group call of the alum making calls toward bottom-up innovation. In short, what we'd done was, prior to completion of this slide deck, I actually completed a focus group style of call with the person in our organization assigned to make these calls. And I wanted to listen to them as serving this project. In that sense, they are an internal customer. And I also wanted to hear the information or stories they might share about key examples of those that they have reached. And so that's the ultimate customer, the external customer. And you can study the slide on your own, perhaps, but a few key pieces came out of that call I did with this individual. And for us, in our process, this person said that email for them over their history of doing these calls beat text or phone attempts to schedule a call. So the notion was to schedule calls, and that emailing, in their experience, was the most effective method for that. Another thing they highlighted was the importance of pre-exit discussions about the nature and value of the calls. And in their estimation, this was very high in importance in achieving, for them, a high outcome call response rate. I wrote a few quotes down. This individual said to me during the focus group call, 10 years ago or more, I got these calls and I found them helpful. They said, I use good humor so I can say just about anything. You could hear the cleverness in that statement. I can find something in common with just about anybody. This person said the outreach that we do is a story. And what they said was that they tell other people that story, and so they don't mind the call. And the idea was that the nature of these calls themselves is networked by those that undergo these calls. The person I spoke with said it was important for them to hold the message for those they serve. Don't knock yourself. The idea, whether it's spoken or unspoken, is that the idea of not knocking yourself is a key starting point and shows up in the nature of the call, the atmosphere, the attitude of the call. Lastly, the person said, I get calls about who could use a call, and I also do those calls. And the story they told me was that other alums call the one doing the calls because they know they do the calls and tip them off about who could use a call. And then this person also does those as well.
I
I
think
asked,
some key features here, Brian, about these points are that it really just reiterates that the story and the conversation hold the answers that you're looking for, not the rote responses to formal questions. So this slide really does embody this concept that we're really coming from a place of service, and that this is part of a high quality service for the client.
that's right. I did ask toward the end of that call, what tips would you give for do's and don'ts to a newer person starting to do this kind of call? And the reply I got was a long pause and then, I'm really not sure. And I thought that was surprising, and I was delighted by that. To me, that seemed to be a sign of something very good in the individual, rather than being naively overconfident. They weren't completely sure about what was most important to say concerning do's and don'ts. And I took that as an indicator of thoughtfulness and the centrality of high quality. So I then asked, if you think of some important bullet points, can you email them to me or give me a call? And the person, of course, said, sure, I'll think about that and let you know. um, there is a story inside this call that I made with this individual. 1/3 of the way into the call I was doing with them about making calls, the person's other phone rang, and I could hear it ring. While I was on that call, the person said their other phone had rang and they needed to answer it, and they did. And with positive energy, they said to the caller that they were on another call, which was the one they were on with me, and they asked, could they call them right back? The person that had called into them agreed, and so the person I called ended the call. Coming back onto my call, I said, and I did have the notion that it was, I said, was that? And the person replied, they interrupted and said, yeah, that was someone calling into me to chase me down for their follow-up call. I told them I'd call them right back. And that shows the idea of turning the incentive structure toward the value of support rather than the call being perceived as something of a nuisance or of no value.
Yeah, and I've done a lot of work with this particular person actually to, from a statistical point of view, capture responses, the quality of responses from our alum. And I can say that he truly approaches these calls with such genuine integrity and authenticity, that, and an intent to serve the client, that I genuinely get a sense that the clients look forward to the calls. So, you know, part of that is just approaching the call with the attitude that you're seeking nothing, you're selling nothing. And it really opens the floor for a genuine dialogue where you can capture most of the answers you're looking for. And then it makes it, once you've had that dialogue, it makes it so much easier to then fill the gaps in at the end if you find that you're missing anything. So many times when I've made these kind of calls, I find that I'm not missing anything at the end of the conversation.
Part two, then, of story time would be as follows. As my call with him ended, this alum interjected to me, oh, I thought of one. I waited to hear, and the person said, don't be too presumptuous. He said, don't put people off. Don't ask questions. They're cynical, and they wonder what we want or why we're calling. I glean by listening. He literally said these things, and I hurriedly wrote them down verbatim.
Yeah. And that really captures the whole point of this educational piece, actually.
We'll do some consolidation. Outcome calls and discharge are concepts from acute care models. Take the long view instead. Replace discharge with a long-term concept such as continuing care. We use alumni serving in a coach capacity to make follow-up calls. This is done using some promising practices from the Lighthouse Recovery Management Checkup Protocol, especially the 20-minute or less call duration. calls warm and accurate, centered in listening and support. Information is filled in with a few remaining questions asked at the end. Ultimately, the customer must experience this as a value add. We call all discharge types, including those that leave against staff advice, ASA, and administrative.
And just to follow up about that, that final point about calling all discharge types, you really want to adopt a no client left behind policy, no pun intended. Follow up with all the clients, and this practice really reinforces the authentic intentions of the organization, and it simultaneously gathers the information about outcomes per discharge type. So it's probable that useful information will come up about trackable reasons for ASA and other types of discharge that the organization can then improve on.
We have some suggested readings. The viewer can pause the slides as they need to as we move along. We wanted to share these with you. Various people and organizations might find some of these helpful. And finally, and afterward, I shared the slide deck and presented the contents with my clinical supervisor, and I wanted to share some of those responses. She said, "Our roots are in detox." And the notion inside the way she said that was the idea of the acute model is something that we need to overcome as a field. She said, check the misses by discharge type and adjust accordingly. In other words, you might have a higher reach rate in one discharge category and lower in another. Use different methods for different categories if necessary. When she said, don't shoot the dog, I knew of that book and had used it in a previous organization. It might have some helpful tips. She stated, the system is broken, not the client. For those who've been in our field a long time, this carries a lot of potential meaning. She asked, is the right person making the calls? Are they too busy? Are they not analytical enough? The idea was the nature of the person. She said, don't call from 8 to 9 a.m. and really meant that as a placeholder of matching your effort to the availability of the person. That reminded me of the notion from behaviorism of the architecture of behavior. When she saw the timeline slide, she said, this is why we have newbies come to graduation. Her idea there was we want a high attendance at graduation ceremonies, so we require the freshmen to come. And that went a long way towards shining light on the value of introducing and reintroducing the importance of calls over time, even from the beginning. She said, set the hook while they're in treatment, capitalizing on the opportunity that the treatment process itself affords to embed the notion of outcome follow-up in care. Finally, the caller should deliver something like a slot machine. Are we hitting enough positives? Are the failed calls because all I encounter are problems and I don't know what we're doing anymore? I don't want to make these calls. She said, seed the audience, sell the positives.
And just to follow up with that last point, I've got a list of very concrete suggestions and tips that you can utilize in the call to cultivate your participant registry and also your response rates with the calls. So start the call by asking, how are you? You might want to make some notes per call about different conversational topics that you discussed in the previous call that you can then bring up again and follow up on with the client to really make them feel like they've been heard and remembered. So mention some points that came from the last program. Ask about events that were discussed in the last conversation and really focus on asking about general well-being. Some other things you can talk about are future plans. It's important to ask what is working, what is not working. keep an eye on your points of interest from your data list and fill in as you hear the answers in the story. And I know we've talked about that before, but it's so important because if you have that list right in front of you, you really can fill in most of it without ever asking a pointed or formal question of the client. Listen well and give space for the client to elaborate in between questions that focus on the genuine interest. But don't overtalk. Give that client space to continue to have a dialogue. And then create an area in your data collection sheet where you can free fill in points that could be useful outside of the data sheet. So if you notice something that might not be working in the call process, or that's really working in the call process, or something that the client mentions, you can follow up about that and make changes to your process. And that brings me to my final point, which is I think it's a good idea to hold, quarterly or monthly team meetings to discuss these points that you discover as callers, and to create and modify your process, integrate those points into your practice.
I'll end by highlighting the notion of calling one's supervisor to review the content and process of method and receive inputs is similar to the notion of focus grouping the one doing the work or the one being served by the work for their inputs. Those could be considered twin strategies for different kinds of inputs that can lead to system change opportunities and improve clarity in that effort. We'll finish up by sharing our bio slides, and we'd like to thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you for being here with us today and listening to our presentation.